Corey Larson. I'm a member of the International Socialist Organization, as is Ahmed, our speaker. We've got a club here at MATC, as well as a couple in the campus. You're all here for a talk called Black Liberation and Socialism and the New Jim Crow, formerly called Malcolm and Martin and the Struggle for Black Liberation. So if you're here for either of those things, you're in the right place. Ahmed, sitting next to me, author of this book, Black Liberation and Socialism. He literally wrote the book on the topic we are talking about. It talks about the rise of slavery. It talks about Malcolm versus Martin. It's a really good book, and he wrote it. Also the editor of the International Socialist Review magazine, both of these published by Haymarket Books, the left book publisher out of Chicago. The subtitle of the talk is End the New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow was popularized by this book by Michelle Alexander, which we're doing a study group on, and we've got a sign up in the back. This book is about the system of mass incarceration and the war on drugs and how they sort of combine to create a new case system in America, and we'll talk about that in the talk. Next week, is that enough? What do you want?
It's great.
I'll give some more announcements later. So the Honorable longtime activist, venerable
Jailbird.
Ahmed Shawki.
Right, folks, I'm enough about the arrest, although I must have been intoxicated, is the joke, because no Arab would drive through Middleton sober. So now let's move on to the talk. People will have seen that yesterday the murderer of, or the killer of Trayvon Martin was finally charged with committing murder in the second degree, which is not premeditated, and that the case will go on trial. However, Trayvon Martin's case touched off a nerve, and right across the country, and unlike many other issues, across racial lines. That is, that what is going on in this country, in particular, but not exclusively, to African Americans, but in particular to African American men and young African American men, has been highlighted by this, what can only be called a vigilante act. We can discuss the merits or dismerits of the case. I think that they've only begun. The questions that have already surfaced are only the tip of the iceberg, because it's not really just about George Zimmerman, but it's also about Sanford. It's about the law that was passed in Florida, which allows you to stand your ground, i.e. which allows people of various persuasions, politically or ideologically, to say that they have the right to use lethal force in quote unquote if they feel threatened. And you just stop and think about the implications of such legislation, or the reality that such a legislation can produce. Trayvon Martin's case is unfortunately another in many hundreds of cases like that. I highly recommend the book. Come on in, folks. I highly recommend the book by Michelle Alexander. It's a meticulously researched book, and it lays out bare the realities of racial inequality, of systematic police violence, and really something that isn't very much talked about, of the institutionalized discrimination or racism against a particular group, African Americans, which I believe is also mirrored in other oppressed minorities, especially the Latino population, the poor, and the ordinary, that is, the people who can't get out of Middleton police departments because they're not 55 with a wallet full of credit cards and can turn on an English accent even if they're inebriated. And that I'm not going to refer to myself anymore, but justice in this country, for most ordinary people, there's no justice at all. The New Jim Crow is a term that has been popularized by Michelle Alexander, but really goes to the heart of the continued systematic discrimination against a group that nominally achieved civil rights. But in order to understand the new Jim Crow, we have to understand what the old Jim Crow was. And the term Jim Crow, although its origins are still disputed by historians exactly where it was, a very good book by an actual Southern historian, a white Southern historian, called The Strange Career of Jim Crow, by a man called C. Vann Woodward, which goes through what it was. People need to know that Jim Crow stood for reaction, stood for white supremacy, stood for the violence of the KKK, which was formed the year after the Civil War ended, in an attempt to maintain the systematic oppression and enslavement of black people under different names. So that in the period from 1865 to the late 1870s, a real and profound upheaval took place in what was the former slave states in order to transform the relations between the classes and between black and white. And it was one of the most magnificent attempts to achieve racial equality, in large part on a population that had been enslaved in the South. That was when you got the first black elected congressman. That's when you got schools that also provided, incidentally, free schooling for white poor children in the South, and an attempt to reshape American society. That attempt failed, and it failed through systematic violence organized by vigilantes. It failed by disfranchising newly enfranchised blacks, that is, taking the vote away, and by the end of the century, enshrining Jim Crow. People know the history, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, all of the decisions that enshrined that as a law. This country, the old Jim Crow, was a country no better, and in some cases worse, than conditions in South Africa, something we were all brought up to say, oh, what a terrible thing, and in the not so recent past. And that's what's essential to understand about the old Jim Crow, is that we're talking about a system of relations that existed and went through the 1960s, not very far away. I quote in the book, and I'll quote the passage now because it's striking, of a young black boy sentenced to death in Alabama for allegedly stealing $1.95 from a white woman. Now, his sentence was commuted, but this is in these United States, in this separate but equal so-called society, that you could have a kid sentenced to death for stealing $1.95, only to have the sentence commuted. Like the new Jim Crow, or the symbol of Trayvon Martin, the symbol of the old Jim Crow that helped break through the segregation of the past generation since the end of slavery, was the case of Emmett Till. How many people are familiar with the case of Emmett Till? Okay. For those who aren't, I'm very happy to, well, it's a brutal case, and I'll read you what I think is a great editorial that was written at the time that's pertinent to today. But the case of Emmett Till is a young boy, 14 years old, from Chicago, goes to Mississippi to visit family. He goes with a cousin of his. He allegedly whistles at a white woman. What do you call it? A wolf whistle? Sorry.
Howl, like howl.
Whatever. Who?
Cat calling.
Good. You get a free drink. Notice this. I did that last night and got hauled over. Okay, so I was just joking anyway. And he is picked up and beaten to death. And his case, 14-year-old who's lynched in the South, he was with his cousin, as I said. I just parenthetically, as a footnote, we organized a meeting last night in which Trayvon's parents called in, Jesse Jackson attended, I believe Jesse, some from Push anyway, he said he'd attend, I haven't been home since, and the cousin, who has now written a book about Emmett Till and coming out to support the Trayvon Martin family. And what's astounding about it is that the similarities between what happened then, that is vigilante violence, i.e. somebody grabbed the kid, underlines what hasn't changed in American society between the old and the new Jim Crow. But I want to just read the passage and then talk a little bit about what has changed and why it's changed, and what we need to do about it if we're to see even further change. And I think that'll take me to the 15 minutes that I've been told to stick to. So I will carefully take 20. Okay, that means I can take 30. Much violence has calloused our sensibilities in this day and age, yet there's something about the murder of Emmett Lewis Till to touch even the coldest heart. The thought that in this America, full-grown and brawny men would abduct a grade school child and beat him in his helplessness until all his teeth were out, his head caved in, his body mutilated with horrible wounds, put a bullet into his brain, and drop him into a river, truly even the most emotionally impervious cannot fail to be aroused. In a decaying social order, man's inhumanity to man includes man's inhumanity to children. And the children, even in their years of hope and lightheartedness, are forced to taste the bitter fruits of knowledge. During the Second World War, one of those public school essay contests in which children are asked to write answers to usually fatuous questions was held, the question being, how would you punish Hitler for his war crimes? On one paper, written by a little black girl, the answer was startling. I would put him in a black skin and force him to spend the rest of his life in the United States. Here was a pathetic early wisdom, and Emmett Lewis Till also in his final hour knew more about our Southland and desperate forces at work in it than any college of sociologists. May we be granted the power to build a world in which our children will be spared such lessons. Now, that was written in 1954 and could have been written, in my opinion, last week in relationship to Emmett Till, and that's the connection that I think we have to ask ourselves between the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow. Jim Crow ended for one reason only, not because of education, bright, young, bushy Washington politicians looking forever to our better future, but because the mass of those who suffered the conditions imposed by Jim Crow rose. And many people rose with them, that is, blacks and whites, but centered really upon the uprising or the awakening of a black population that said, enough is enough. Without that, there would not have been an end to slavery, without that kind of awakening, because slavery was not abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation. We can discuss all those questions. The Emancipation Proclamation only abolished slavery in the states that the North did not control. Okay, so I see, wait a minute. A war? We're abolishing your slavery, but not where we run it. It's true history. Black people were not allowed to fight. It was only after, from slavery, people risked their lives and fought and ran away and volunteered to end slavery by force of arms did the whole process begin to unravel, and the Union Army was transformed, the whole North was transformed. The same is true about the period in which Jim Crow was imposed. That is, it was the defeat of the aspirations of black people, and by the way, those of white people in the South as well, that led to the creation of new Jim Crow. Now, why did I just add that quietly? Because racism is not just about oppressing those who are the victims of oppression, but it is about oppressing the majority. And the value of racism, because racism has not existed for time immemorial, in fact most historians agree, but it's a fairly recent phenomenon, has, in the words of Frederick Douglass, and if people don't know Frederick Douglass, well, go and read Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became the most important black radical. He didn't start, nobody started. I'm a radical, I'm around the bend, or whatever the equivalent word is. People start by saying, I believe something is right, and in the case of that time period, abolition, what was right. It was a minority movement, and people were shunned, they were arrested. I won't go to DWIs, but anyway, they were shunned aside. Without their struggle, no end of slavery. Without struggle, Frederick Douglass said, there will not be any progress. No struggle, no progress. That struggle can be physical, it can be moral, but there has to be struggle. Now, The key connection between the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow is there was struggle, many advances were made, and in the last 30 years, that struggle has been very one-sided. That is, we went from a period in which all kinds of things, all kinds of reforms that benefited those not in power were achieved, and the last 30 years they've spent clawing each one of them back. And when I say it affects white and black, quote Douglas again, I'll just do it from memory. It's fairly accurate, which means don't trust me, go and read it for yourselves. If that convinces you to read Douglas, I'll misquote him all day long. In which he says, the slaveholders, the secret of slavery is that the slaveholders put enmity in one to the other to conquer both. And he understood that the majority of poor whites in the South actually didn't own any slaves. There were only 1,733 families in the South that owned more than 100 slaves. Okay? I'm not saying that the others who owned slaves were innocents or anything of the kind, but it was by pitting one against the other and giving them a sense that they're part of the majority, color of your skin, that the allegiance of whites was one, and they were able to screw both, which is why the worst social legislation in the country has always been in the South. Wages are lower in the South, so on and so forth. You want to bring the story up to the modern day? Racism was the key issue that was the wedge to try to push back many of the civil rights movements, the women's movement, the black movement, the anti-war movement of the 1960s. It was called the Southern Strategy. It wasn't called the white supremacy strategy. It was written by a guy called Kevin Phillips. I don't know if people know who he is. He's now become a much more left-wing journalist who writes about it and said, I worked for the Republican Party. We had to figure out how do we get ourselves back in the South. I know how. We'll use the Southern Strategy, which is to scare the shit out of white folks that black people were going to overtake their rights. Gee whiz, it worked. The Democratic Party went from being the party that controlled the South into the Republicans controlling it, and the huge and winning people. It's the same with welfare. People know the image of poor black women, Cadillacs, welfare. Remember that? The majority of people who actually get welfare have to be poor and white. But it served a particular purpose to push in that direction. What am I really saying? To sum up, and I have to say something about Martin and Malcolm because you brought it up.
Ask a question.
All right, well, let me use you as a shill, come on. I'm saying that racism is not really a question of just bad ideas. Yes, there are all kinds of ignorant people out there. And ideas have to be combated. But racism, again, it doesn't come naturally. It is built into a particular economic political system that benefits from the existence of that racism. It's much clearer under slavery. Well, who benefits? The slaveholders. Who are they? The tiny plutocracy or aristocracy that owns the slaves. That's much more clear. I believe to understand racism, you have to understand that it's been embedded in the history of American capitalism and institutionalized. There is no way to explain the systematic discrimination. Just look at the figures in the new Jim Crow without understanding something more than this jack-off's attitudes to black people is to blame for this situation. It was, by the way, the conclusion that the black movement arrived at the end of the 1960s. Now, what do I mean by the black movement? I mean all sections of the black movement, beginning with the most popular, Martin Luther King, who, if you read his writings carefully, begins with a point of view that says we can use liberals in the North to help end segregation in the South. Well, it did it. Beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott through to the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of the acts that passed. He came to a conclusion about that and said, you know what? I could give in the discussion, if you want the quotes, they're wonderful. I'll give them to you. I'll read them. I quoted him at some length. He suddenly discovered something else, that the liberals in the North were fine when it came to Southern illegal slavery. Laws are changed. He went north and found out yesterday's allies were today's enemies. The Northern power structure didn't want black equality in the North. They just wanted it, like the Emancipation Proclamation, in those areas they didn't control. and that he went smack up against the Democratic Party establishment and Northern liberalism. And he began changing his views, saying it's not enough to change racial attitudes or change the laws. We have to change the actual system that begets those laws. And I'll close with a quote from him, because he says it much better than I am. Malcolm X, who was seen as the antithesis of Martin Luther King, and the opposite of, actually was not as opposed, especially later in his life, to some of the same ideas, which could be summarized in the following. He believed in the beginning in black separation. The only way we can get justice is to separate. He didn't become a socialist. He didn't say, we have the same interests, black and white, we have to change the economic structure. But he began to understand having legal rights without changing the economic structure is not really having won those legal rights. That is, that a systemic change was needed to root out the vested interests that promoted racism and slavery. And here's how Martin Luther King put it, and I will sum up after that. I know it's already time. We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself. This is MLK in '67. The question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? By the way, today you can just change that figure to 40 million without health care, let alone how many poor, but we can update the statistics later. I'll keep reading. And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to ask the question about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? These are questions which must be asked. Little known about Martin Luther King, that same year he came out and denounced the American war in Vietnam. He stopped attacking youth who were rebelling in many cities against police violence, and came out with one of the most amazing speeches that he gave in New York City at the Riverside Church, in which he said the issues of poverty, war, and racism are intimately tied. I can no longer keep my voice silent. I will denounce the evils of this society because the solution to the question of racism is connected to the problem of war, is connected to the problem of poverty. He was denounced for that in the New York Times by virtually every major political leader in the country, Martin's gone off the deep end and so on and so forth. And at the end of his life, as people know, began to organize a poor people's movement. That is, began to understand that the question of racism and class and poverty are intimately tied. And he began really to think about a social solution, which is something that most people, how many people here have read Animal Farm? Gee, wow. Conclusion, try to change things, it'll be worse if you do. Okay? It's not surprising that most of you have read it. There's a reason they teach that, and there's a reason that they teach you that socialism is bad, and so on and so forth. Those who fought in the civil rights movement drew the conclusion we need an economic restructuring in society. That's at the core of socialism. The other part at the core of socialism is the democratic control of people over their lives and their environment, and being able to determine what to do with the resources of society, not to leave that up to the search for profit, which has, in my opinion, devastated this country and its population. I moved here in 1976. In 1983, I got a job as a typesetter. I used to make, get mad, $23 an hour. That's in a non-union shop because they had to compete with union shops. We used to joke about the $15 shit break, but that's because we worked 60 hours a week. After 45, we were on double time. That was a good life. The starting wage at a UPS part-time job was $16 an hour with full health benefits. Try to find that in the industrial Midwest. Sorry, try to find the industrial Midwest. And I think that the promise of The ever-growing capitalism has turned into a population which has accepted and learned to accept to eat shit. And I use that term categorically about Americans. People who didn't talk, we're proud, we're mighty, and we're strong. Visit the cities up and down Wisconsin that used to be the industrial heartland and see what people do. And the ugly side of it is the Trayvon marking and the systematic violence that goes. Visit places like Detroit. Want to visit Blacktown? Try Youngstown, Ohio. And I believe that it's time for a new generation to take up the fight that many people began during the last Jim Crow. And it's in your hands rather than in people of my generation. But I hope that in some ways this talk opens up thinking. As Malcolm X said, think for yourself. Read, educate yourself, and don't be fooled. And lastly, to do something about it. That's the one thing nobody ever does in this country. Everybody knows City Hall's corrupt. It's kind of a cynicism. And you can't do anything about it because it'll always be that way. Not true. With struggle, we can actually change things. End of solution.
All right. Thanks for listening.